will speak about relations between the European Union and Russia in light of Russia's war against Ukraine. Our special guest is Heidi Hautala, Vice President of the European Parliament, elected in Finland on the list of the Green League. Mrs. Hautala is serving her 5th term in the European Parliament and has dealt for many years with international trade, EU external relations, human rights, development, legal affairs, and the EU budget. We are joined by Jim Closs, TEPSA's Secretary General and former Director General at the General Secretariat of the Council of the European Union. Our discussion follows the recent publication of a book on Russia and the future of Europe, written by experts from 41 European countries, from the network of the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, TEPSA. The book describes different national debates on relations with Russia, and Mrs. Hautala has kindly written the foreword. Heidi, Jim, welcome. The European Parliament recently voted with a large majority a resolution designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, a state that uses means of terrorism and is committing war crimes in Ukraine. What is the political significance of this resolution, and will it have any practical consequences?
Yeah, indeed. Maybe I can reveal to you that there was quite a lot of debate about whether such a resolution should be adopted by the European Parliament. Why? Not because we would not be condemning the atrocities, the war crimes, crimes against humanity of Russia in Ukraine, but because there's actually no legal basis in the EU to regulate and designate states as sponsors of terrorism, unlike in the United States and Canada. But I think when things went on, we realized that this is not a judicial question at the moment. It's not a legal question primarily. It's also a political statement. And because I sort of prefer to be, let's say, correct in legal terms, I was personally very satisfied because the resolution actually states this lack of legal basis, and it calls on the EU to designate such a legal basis. So the practical conclusions, I think, perhaps reflect the kind of escalation of the atrocities, especially now against the civilians, when we see that the life-threatening bombardments are denying Ukrainian civilians of heat, access to water, and very basic prerequisites of life. So it reflects the kind of growing condemnation of Russia's actions by the European Parliament. And this was voted through with a very large majority. So large that I didn't want to care to see who was voting against, because it was such an insignificant number of people.
Yeah. What do you see as the end game of the ongoing war in Ukraine? From an EU perspective, is it a total defeat of Russia, or would something more modest be acceptable and possibly stable? How would you define the victory of Ukraine?
Well, I very much believe that, as has been said by many, that at the moment we need to continue to make sure that Ukraine gains and comes into a position of strength. We have seen promising signs, of course, through the, let's say, exit of Russian troops from Kherson and some other occupied regions, but this is not yet the time when Ukraine can be confident that entering into some kind of peace talks would make it free of the occupying force. So I believe that the end game needs to be to continue the support, and there, of course, we have challenges. We have to make sure that people follow this and that they are not, let's say, coming to this thought that fighting on the side of Ukraine, supporting Ukraine is actually life-threatening or too painful for the EU citizens.
I first of all, on the question of sponsoring of terrorism, I completely share what Heidi said. I think this is a political statement, and it's a strong political statement. The question in terms of legal effects, no, not for the time being, but it's political. we all agree that what the Russians are doing is terrorizing the Ukrainian population, and that's unacceptable. So I think we agree on that. In terms of the end game, it's too early to talk about an end game, frankly. And again, I agree. I think the sequence of things has to be, one, support Ukraine so that Putin doesn't win. Put the Ukrainians in a position of strength. At some stage, there will be negotiations or a ceasefire. The question is primarily for the Ukrainians to decide this. We should not dictate this to them at this stage. But of course, at some stage, if you talk about the end game, you see, I see the reconstruction of Ukraine. I see Ukraine being rebuilt. And I also see at some stage, when the condition is right, an effort at reconstructing some relations with a new Russia. But it's far too early today.
I agree, and I would want to add that a part of the end game is to fully incorporate Ukraine according to Ukrainians' wish as a part of the European Union. And we of course know that the EU has been supportive of Ukrainian efforts to eradicate anti-corruption, to put their competition laws in place, all that before the war. But now all these efforts must be accelerated, because it's also a question of really security for Ukraine to be able one day to join the European Union. And of course the EU member states made a very, let's say, a strong change of course by accepting Ukraine in the early summer as a candidate country. But I think it reflects the fact that we feel more and more that Ukraine wants to be one of us. It is one of us. And now, not just the European Parliament, but also for the member states agree that at the end game is that they must have a possibility to become a full member, like Moldova and perhaps Georgia, which now seems to be struggling with its own reforms more than any of the two countries in war.
The awarding of the status was a game changer. And I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, no one would even have dreamt about this. This was a geopolitical decision by the EU, replying to Putin having burned all the bridges with Ukraine. There is, of course, another aspect to the whole enlargement, which we should not neglect. It is, of course, also at some stage about the functioning of the EU, our absorption capacity. But where I do agree is that we should not waste time in working towards this, also in terms of as soon as Ukraine, I mean, now they're in the midst of a war, it's difficult to ask them to reform the competition authority. But as soon as the conditions are ripe, we should very quickly push this, because you need the two. You cannot just take a decision on enlargement which is purely geostrategic. You also have to make it work with our system.
By the way, if I may, also if we look in a bit further to Central Asia, we see that now many of the, let's say, former Soviet republics and states, they kind of show Putin that they are not anymore playing Putin's game. And I think this has been quite significant. And I recall that the president of Kazakhstan, in the presence of Putin, he really made this quite clear. And he added in another context that he wants to make sure that Kazakhstan is not finding its way to the wrong side of the new Iron Curtain. This is quite tough, I would say. And there's a geopolitics in, we have to really strengthen our relations with those countries as well, because there is this aspiration for democracy and prosperity, which can be about strengthened relations with the European Union. In the pressure, China, Russia, the EU. The EU has its attraction to those countries now as well.
Just one word on the ceasefire. I think we replied to that before. And as Heidi said, I mean, a ceasefire is something which particularly the belligerents have to decide at some stage. And the Ukrainians have to feel there could be a situation where they are in such a situation that they need a ceasefire too. So we should not sort of say no to a ceasefire or yes to a ceasefire now. I think we should remain relatively quiet about this.
Well, many Europeans are concerned about the escalation of the war. Also, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned that NATO's aim is to prevent the conflict in Ukraine from escalating beyond Ukraine and pledged support to Ukraine's long haul. Is it the case that it suits the West that Russian army is suffering big losses, that Ukraine is containing Russia, defending the rules-based order and values we call European, but at the same time we are coming to accept a long war in Ukraine as the new normal, and we are perhaps not doing enough to help Ukraine win the war sooner and with fewer casualties? Could the West do more?
Yeah, I think we saw how much caution the countries showed, and let's say how much they took time and energy to identify who actually has launched this missile that hit and killed 2 people across the Polish border from Ukraine. And I think it shows that we have to be very careful, because Putin is totally unpredictable, and nobody can exclude that he will make real from what he has said, that he is waging war against the West, Western values. So he's declared a kind of a total war, and to give him any opportunity to make that happen, I think would have very drastic consequences. That's my feeling. Mm-hmm. And knowing all these false flag operations that countries like Russia and the Soviet Union with Finland in 1939 also used, I think diligence is very important, that we do not sort of act out of a feeling of a moment, and we should not be provoked. That's my feeling.
Yeah. Now, I think the fact that our leaders, both the Americans and the Europeans, want to avoid escalation, I mean, it's their duty. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't find that shocking. The question only is, it has not to be done in a way that you give the impression to Putin that we are scared stiff. We're not. And I thought the reaction by NATO was actually very professional in this respect. So, but trying to avoid escalation is normal. I mean, no one wants a third world war about this. So we just have to keep calm, look at the situation, not give the impression we are completely sort of in awe before Putin, because I agree with you, he's unpredictable. At the same time, I think NATO is pretty strong. I mean, I'm not personally terribly worried about this.
Well, in the EU, we speak a lot about the support of Ukraine, and I think already we have used this word a couple of times during this conversation, and for very good reasons, obviously. But aren't we slightly missing the point when we speak about the support to Ukraine? And I'm here quoting President Zelensky, who said, you are paying for your freedom, not for Ukraine. Do you think that the EU citizens realize sufficiently to what extent the outcome of this war in Ukraine matters for the future of Europe and the future order on our continent?
Yeah, I first of all, I believe that it is Zelensky's role to be very tough on us, to ask for more, to demand more, so that he will get the maximum that can be given, and we are not doing that yet, I think. But then the support of the citizens, I think it varies from member states to member states, and of course, just to quote one example, there was an opinion poll among EU countries some months ago, though, so things may have changed, that on who is the perpetrator, who is guilty of this, who is responsible for this war of aggression. 90% of Finnish people say Russia, only 60% of Italians. So there are different narratives and traditions, which actually has been very well described in the book that TEPSA has put together, which is a very rich source of these differences, which then all of a sudden, after the publishing of the book, actually turned out to some sort of unity. And that holds at the moment. But there are differences, and the sort of deep streams of thinking in different countries now, of course, may materialize more when the war continues. But we have to take care that the Russian narrative is not winning in EU member states. And even more worryingly, I think it seems to be winning in countries of global south, where Russia is now very, very actively trying to find new friends and partners. And also the EU is a partner of many of those countries. I think we should not patronize them in any way, but we can tell them that why we had this food security crisis is not because of sanctions against Russia, but they are because of Russia starting an illegitimate, illegal war against Ukraine, and that has to be stopped.
I think your question almost sounds as if support to Ukraine was not the right expression. I think, of course, that's what we're doing, support of Ukraine. Once you do that, if you do support Ukraine, the reason behind of why we do it, well, obviously there are various issues. One is that we genuinely want to help the Ukrainians. Secondly, we genuinely think it's in our interest to do so, otherwise we wouldn't do it. So I think in that respect, this is a slightly artificial thing. And I think, as Heidi said, I mean, Zelensky is, of course, as a president in a very difficult situation, pushed the maximum pressure. I would, however, also say that it is fine to say the Europeans could do more, the Americans could do more. It's also fair to say that actually the EU has done a lot over the past years. 8 sanctions packages, the recognition of the accession status of Ukraine, which is absolutely a game changer. The military help, I mean, I agree, we are not a military superpower, but using more than 3 billion euros of the EU budget to arm Ukraine is also a very big step in the right direction. So I just want to say that you can always do more, but you also have to recognize, if you want to keep the people in Europe on board, you cannot just tell them what you're doing is nothing, it doesn't represent anything. That's not the right approach, I'm sorry. So I think it's important to say, this is good, it goes very much in the right direction. It would be good if you could do even more. That's the way to address it.
Yeah, I even think that we criticize Germany a bit too much. We can discuss the past of Russia-German relations, but with the new government, and I'm very happy to see that we have a very sort of energetic green foreign minister from my party. They have made a U-turn in military support. So it's not nothing, not at all.
Well, I think both of you referred to the military support. If I may ask there, out of all the military support now going to Ukraine, only 2% is coming from France, apparently, only 3% from Italy, only 9% from Germany. I mean, what does this, I understand the EU is not a huge military power. I mean, this is something that we acknowledge. But if you look at the member states, it also might not be very impressive, the military support that they are giving to Ukraine. So here maybe my question to you would be, both of you mentioned that support coming from Europe could be more than it currently is. So what could it be? What could be more?
Well, there will be more, that's clear. And it's actually quite admirable that such a small member state like Estonia per capita is supporting Ukraine more than any other. So the smallest one who actually knows Russia very, very well, much better than we thought a few years ago, by the way. Well, there will be more, and there is this European Peace Facility, it's called, which is, I think, which has to be replenished, and then so yes, we need to definitely work for more.
Well, Heidi, you also said that only around 60% of Italians thought that Russia was a perpetrator in the war. isn't this a sign that we actually really need to work on calling things by their name? And this brings me to my next question, which is, about whether this war in Ukraine is genocidal in nature. Seeing all the attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, on hospitals, on houses, murders of thousands of civilians, then kidnapping and deportation of thousands of children, attempts at eradicating Ukrainian language. Is Russia's war in Ukraine genocidal in nature, and if so, why do not more people designate it as such?
Well, I think in the very last times, the Russian leaders and sort of operators close to the Russian leadership have escalated their language a little bit to this direction, talking about extermination of the whole nation. It does not have the right to existence. The language is not a real language, and so on. But nevertheless, I think Jim said a bit earlier that we have to keep calm. We have to make sure that we don't miss evidence of whatever will then by legal experts to be defined as at least war crimes, crimes against humanity. And then the question of genocide is quite, it's a very strong concept that has to be used very wisely. So I would leave it to the legal experts. We have made a few mistakes earlier on in different situations, and but anyway, there's enough to say that Russia is conducting and committing huge atrocities.
Yes, if I may say so, it's a very important point. Also in view of what you hear in Africa, in Latin America and all of that, where they actually see this war as a classical European war. And so if we sort of play the genocide thing, they will say this is pure propaganda. We have to be very careful with that in order that it doesn't backfire. Heidi made a very important point. It is true that in terms of the rhetoric in Russia, it has gone over the top and they say things like that. But that's not in itself a genocide. We have to be very careful about that. It reminds me, since I come from Luxembourg, this language about the Ukrainians being bad Russians and they don't really exist, don't have a language. That's exactly what the Nazis said about the Luxembourgers in 40.
Considering Russia's imperial aspirations revealed so clearly during the ongoing war, do you see a prospect for restoring normal relations between the EU and Russia in the horizon of 5 to 10 years? Do you think that the Russian society is ready for repentance, for reckoning with Russia's imperialism, and for paying reparations?
I do not think that Russian society, Russia as a state, is ready to turn into, let's say, a normal democracy respecting international law, human rights, civil rights. At the moment, I think we can see that let's say that the civil liberties have been completely crushed. This has been, in my observation, let's say a kind of a systemic change, at least since 2012. We can go to earlier years as well, but I mean it was very plain when Putin entered the his third term as president in 2012 that since then we have all these laws on foreign agents, the undesirable organizations, whatnot, extremism. I think this will decide how normal the relations between Russia and the European Union can become, and I don't see a normalcy in sight. But I'm reading with great interest, for instance, now Alexei Navalny and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who don't really work well together, but they both come to the same conclusion that in order to become normal, Russia must establish some sort of parliamentary system. Why? Because like Khodorkovsky puts it, there's no good Tsar. He says that even if he would become president, which he doesn't believe he would be, then for a moment he would sort of be very democratic, but then he would start to use his absolute powers as president. So there needs to be a new constitution, a new kind of social contract also. And that's quite exciting because now we have so many, let's say, I call them moral migrants, moral emigrants from Russia, people who cannot anymore fulfill any kind of aspirations in the Russian situation, with the war, with the abolition of free media, civil liberties. And I think we can kind of cultivate a little bit the work of this Russian new diaspora, because they are now, many of them are outside Russia, so they are within our reach. I mean, for 9 years now, I think I'm, no, 7 years I'm on the blacklist, so I could not go to Russia since 2015. But now many people that I want to meet and talk to, they are here, you know, in Berlin, in Brussels, in Helsinki, some of them. And that's, I think, a great opportunity. We should be much more active towards this.
I think this is a very important point, because for the time being, I mean, it's clear, I have real doubts that with Putin we can really get into a normal relationship at all. So in the short term, I'm quite pessimistic. In the longer term, I do agree with you. Well, we have to hope that there will be some epiphany at some stage in Russia, and that they. But it's difficult, because the moral. I want to say a word about the morality in the society. It's down. If you have an army which goes to the prisons to recruit people, it's a very bad sign. And incidentally, in a Russian book I read, came out in 2012, that was one of the themes of the book, where they already said, contrary to the Soviet times, we're now going to the prisons to recruit people. So I saw a very interesting video recently by someone called Wexler, of Russian origin, who started with Thomas Mann's example, Thomas Mann who said, we cannot pretend that Hitler was not German. The Russians cannot pretend that Putin is not Russian. That does not mean taking individual guilt, but it is the need to feel a bit of responsibility. And then he developed a whole thesis about how the Russians have more and more concentrated their ethical approach to the smallest possible group and have no empathy outside, not even to their fellow citizens, like the Buryats, who are killed much more massively than the people in St. Petersburg and Moscow. I thought this was very interesting, because you touched the governance and political issue, which is crucial, but there's also a societal issue here for the Russians. And this is also something with the Russians you were talking about. We should actually talk to those people, because the regeneration of society has to come from inside at some stage.
Not long ago, I went to Berlin to a concert of a famous rock star called Zemfira, who's my favorite since many years. And I saw thousands and thousands of Russian Europeans, European Russians. I only heard Russian language, perhaps Ukrainian, but I cannot recognize the difference too well. And that was a concert against the war. And they were supporting Ukraine. So we have these people in masses now that want to become European Russians or Russian Europeans. And that's a great chance, I think.
I think my question would be because so far I haven't really myself, I haven't been to the concert of Zemfira, but I haven't really seen mass rallies of Russian diaspora, neither here in the European Union, nor in Georgia, for example, where they're coming in thousands. Yes. There has been hardly any support of Russians for Ukraine. And this brings actually me to another question, which is about Russia's opposition. You alluded to that as well already, but can we speak of a significant group of liberals who imagine Russia as a state rather than an empire? How many Russians are willing to question the imperial project? For example, Alexei Navalny has so far refused to acknowledge Crimea as part of Ukraine. His circle has been calling for a post-war Marshall Plan for Russia to avoid the feeling of injustice among the Russians. But we have not really heard many suggestions from the Russian opposition that it is actually Ukraine as the victim of Russian aggression that will need a lot of reconstruction funding. There are certainly Russians who want to get rid of Putin's dictatorship, but are they also willing to give up on Russian imperial ambitions?
Some of them, the genuine Democrats, I think, but let's be honest, there were a few years in the 90s when the window of opportunity was there, and it closed already a little before Putin entered into power. I think already the danger, let's say, appeared in the last years of Yeltsin. But I go back to 1991, You only have to compare how the German reunification, where an important part was the total, let's say, how do you call it, lustration of the kind of eradication of all the secret services, the Stasi, and to go through the crimes of Stasi against people. People then got to understand why they were discriminated against at the institutions and why they lost their property and all that. But this never happened in Russia. If you look at 1991, only perhaps the statue of the founder of Cheka, the secret police, was carried away. But there was no sort of deep look into the deep state, which is still, I mean, this is, Russia is ruled by the deep state. It's the FSB, GRU, all these secret services. And unless there will be some kind of procedure to eradicate these powers from the control they have now, I don't think anything can happen. And that has to do with the crimes of Stalin. It has to do with, let's say, rehabilitation of victims of the dictatorship. So I don't see this happen immediately, but perhaps after some deeper trouble in the society. What comes after Putin doesn't look very good to me at the moment, but perhaps before things start to get better, they usually tend to get worse. That's a little bit my feeling about the Marshall Plan. Needs to involve the Russian institutions primarily for me.
We are unfortunately not there yet. I agree this will be long, but we should not completely give up hope. The problem is, of course, that, and you see this in someone like Navalny, that the nationalist factor is very strong in Russia, and the propaganda has been hammering this at school, everywhere. They are now reintroducing the obligatory military service at the university. So it's difficult. It will be difficult. But at the same time, I personally tend to think that I don't see Putin winning, frankly. And as soon as it becomes obvious to more Russians that Putin is losing, things can go much more quickly than we think.
That gives some hope indeed.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe one last question to both Jim and Heidi, and that would be, what would be one major shift, if any, that you would like to see in EU's foreign and security policy as a lesson from Russia's war in Ukraine?
Now this is tough, maybe you start.
Yes, okay, so you have the last word. And, actually, my answer is, I don't have an answer to such questions, because there is no simplistic one thing panacea. What I would say, however, is that, and I come back to something I said before, it is that actually the EU has taken a number of steps, some of them small, some quite big, which I mentioned before. So I do not see, and certainly if you mention CFSP, which is a very small part of our policy, frankly, I don't see a big development of CFSP which will change the game here. I think we move by increment, we move sometimes bigger steps. It all together, I think, should lead to a paradigm shift. And I think there are elements of hope for this.
Yeah, that gave me some seconds to think about the answer. And I would perhaps say that yes, but the EU as such is a great social and political innovation, which the world needs. And I'm looking at Southeast Asia, I'm looking a little bit at Latin America, and I hope that I see over the years, even in Africa, this kind of let's say international organizations that then step by step become democratic, you know, to the extent that at the end of the day they may have directly elected parliaments like the European Parliament. So that's already something that is a strong step towards peace and security. And I think we have to remember also that countries that are democratic, they do not declare wars against each other. So I would say, to coming more together under international rules is what we and that is in the let's say in the essence of EU's efforts in the world as well. So we may be unhappy about the lack of qualified majority voting on security and defense policy and things like that, but I think the basic thing is that these 27 countries, there's still 27, are working every day peacefully with each other, with some issues that need to be solved, but I don't want to start a new debate.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and thank you very much, Jim, for your insights, for your views, and thank you all for watching. We will be back with further episodes soon, and we hope that you will be part of them as well.